Thank you for watching Faith in Flagler because building faith strengthens our community. I'd like to start out by thanking three sponsors, Douglas Property and Development, Stevenson Wilcox and Associates, and Big John's Appliances. Thank you so much for supporting and encouraging the show, Faith in Flagler. I have as a guest today, Will Motosicky, the lead pastor at Recovery Church, Palm Coast. So make sure I said your name correctly, right, Will?
Yeah, correct.
You probably get that a lot, right?
Yeah, it's easy when you look at it too, but
It's all good. So, unlike most of the other pastors who I've had on the show, I've never met you in person. So, I'd like just get to know you just a little bit. Like, where, do you live in Palm Coast? How did you arrive in the area?
yep, I live in Palm Coast. I moved to Florida from Pittsburgh probably about 11 years ago now. And I originally moved into Ormond Beach, and then I moved up here to Palm Coast probably about 5 years ago.
Okay, very good. So I just looked up a little bit online about the church. It's called Recovery Church Palm Coast, which it says in the logo that it's a movement. So can you tell me a little bit about what this movement is all about?
Well, there's a bigger organization of it, and it's the Recovery Church movement. And what it really is, I came into contact with the founder. His name's Phil Dvorak. He has a recovery church that he pastors in Lake Worth. And about 3 years ago, I was invited to go to a retreat. And at the retreat, I met Phil. I heard his vision for what he had for these recovery churches. And then it just kind of blossomed from there. About 3 years ago, I planted, with the help of him and many others, the Recovery Church in Palm Coast. So from that right there, I got to help plant a recovery church in Daytona. Oak Hill was another place. There's another recovery church in Ormond Beach. I got to plant another recovery church in the Flagler County jail. We have a church in there. I go in there and I carry the message to the men. And then my wife goes in on Thursdays and carries the message for the women. So
Very cool. What is that
growing.
like? What is that like to talk to people in jail in that way?
One thing about it's fantastic because I was there. I spent the majority of my life, 17 years of my life in jail, in and out of the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Celebrate Recovery, in and out of all of those rooms. So I've been blessed with an opportunity to go back and reach those individuals, who are struggling with what I once struggled with, and that's kind of like the vision behind Recovery Church, is to bridge that gap. Bridge that gap between all of those meetings, all of those AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery meetings, and between that Sunday congregation, is really bridge that gap between the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the bigger big book, the Bible, and get back to what the intention was. One of the things we always kind of emphasize, when Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, when they wrote the program of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1930s, the goal was a spiritual awakening. The goal was a spiritual experience. The goal was a relationship with Christ. And Bill says it, crystal clear in his testimony, in his story, in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, in the book. Bill says a relationship with Christ, So really, it's kind of leading individuals to what the original authors intended to be.
So how does a relationship with Jesus help somebody recover, or through, who is recovering still, stay strong?
I think our root, right? The root of our issue is not the drug, it's not the alcohol, It's not the gambling. It's not the women. The root of our issue is selfishness, self-centeredness, right? And they say in the book, selfishness, self-centeredness, driven by 1,000 forms of fear. I mean, that's the issue is sin, because we are driven by what we want, how we want, when we want, and greed, the alcohol, the drug, the gambling, the lust, fear, anger. Those are all just our coping mechanisms. What the real problem is, once we have that relationship with Christ, right? Once we're in that position of neutrality, we're at peace, then we really know, we really have some comfort. We really have some understanding, we use substances, right? We use sin because we don't have that peace and understanding. Christ is the only way, for that peace and understanding, a relationship with him. So that's what we're trying to direct and encourage people, even the 12th step, right? The 12th step of the program, Alcoholics Anonymous, says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result, right? I carry this message of alcoholics and practice these principles in my affairs. The result is the spiritual awakening. Anything outside of that is just a byproduct. Me being a good father, me being a good member of society, a good husband, a good active churchgoer. It's all a byproduct of that spiritual awakening and that relationship with Christ, which the program is geared for us to strive to.
When you think about the impact that it makes to have somebody who, like you're talking about, people who are really struggling with addictions of various kinds, somebody can recover from that and lead a more, productive life like you're describing. It seems like it has a real huge impact because, that person might be possibly doing some harm in the community. Instead, they would go from being a negative to being a positive in the community. Can you tell me, like, what is it like to see somebody make that kind of a change?
Man, it is such a blessing, and that's one of the goals. I think that is the goal to being a follower of Christ, right? The resurrected Christ, he gave us one command, essentially, right? To go make disciples of all nations, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? Making disciples, right? So me as a leader, as a pastor, I'm using this lightly, sponsor, right? If I'm not making disciples, then what am I doing? Getting to be involved in these men's lives and ladies, and see that change. I mean, that Acts 9, road to Damascus, Saul to Paul transformation in these men and women's lives. I mean, it's beautiful. And it is only because of Christ. It's only because of the grace he offers, And there's been so many, Brian, there has been so many men and so many ladies, that I finally saw, that they finally saw that surrender and that peace and that acceptance and that transformation. One of the greatest things that I have learned in my short time, okay, I've only been pastoring this church now for about 3 years. In my short time, it's not necessarily getting to see God work in people's lives, but it's getting to see God work in people's lives and them noticing it and noticing that it's God. I mean, that has been such a blessing.
Yeah.
But
What do you, when somebody does make that change, you mentioned the word surrender, and that sounds like a really negative word outside of like Christian, when you're not talking to other Christians, surrender sounds pretty bad. Like, I just lost.
right.
So what is the context and what does surrendering really mean to you?
Well, right. We already discussed the root of the issue. The root of the issue is me. It's selfishness. So getting to surrender myself, kind of giving up control. It's freeing. You know, when I'm not sitting there having to worry about today and tomorrow and constantly, you know, distracted when the check engine light comes on in the car driving down the road, you know, and I can kind of surrender that and just give it to God and say, God, I know you're going to take care of me. I know you're going to provide, you know,
Jesus, take the wheel, right?
literally, right? I think it's just society. I mean, I think that sin nature, that self-centeredness, we have just taken that word and just, you know, and tweaked it. You know, surrender isn't negative, it's freeing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's in control for.
Yeah. So I noticed also online on the website that you have an open share time. So what is that like? I could imagine that sort of like being very unpredictable and out of control, but I could also imagine it being like really genuine and some real truth being spoken there. So can you tell me what that's like?
One of the things about our open share time is it's unique to Recovery Church. You go to any meeting, you go to AA meetings, you go to any of the meetings, and you know, they'll vent. But at Recovery Church, we're not necessarily sharing with each other, we're sharing with our Father. Right? So our open share time is prayer time. Our open share time is actually what's on our hearts, what brought us here. You know, I heard a long time ago when I first got sober, December 13th, 2015 was my first day of permanent sobriety. I would always go to my sponsor, right? I went to a traditional AA Big Book Step Study meeting, and I would go to my sponsor and I would always ask him for his opinion. I would always ask him for his directions, his instruction. And the only thing he told me was, Will, did you pray about it? I'm like, no, well, that's why I'm calling you, you know? He goes, yeah, in my instructions, you need to pray about it because God's the only person who can answer it.
But it's easier to get an answer from a person than from God sometimes. At least it's easier to understand what he's saying, right?
Well, I think that was the key behind this lesson he taught me. And that's the key kind of behind our prayer time, you know? Because I can pray with you together. You and I, right? When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm in your midst, right? We can gather together and pray, you know? And that's really what he was searching for, you know? That's really kind of what our open share time is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a time for the church just to get down and let's pray. You know, if you need personal prayer, we'll put hands on you, we'll pray. You know, we have these things we call surrender crosses. We literally just posted a video on YouTube and Facebook of how they're made. You know, you go in traditional meeting, they'll give you a white chip, or, you know, day one. But these surrender crosses are designed for that day that you surrender that thing that brought you through that door. And you keep it in your pocket, you wear it around your neck, you hang it from your mirror in your car. That way, when that thing comes back and starts creeping back up, you can see that current surrender cross and it triggers, you know, hey, I remember that day, Father, I'm struggling with this. You know, so that's one thing. We're always trying to direct people to the man with the solution, you know.
Maybe this is even, you know, a very appropriate verse to think about when we're talking about addiction, because it gets kind of warped, I think, with addiction. But in Matthew 5:6, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, blessed are ye who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for you shall be filled. And so what does that mean to you? What does that concept mean to you?
I think it signifies that desire, you know. One thing that I've learned, even in myself from my lived experience working with others, is that willingness is something that can't be taught. I can't teach you how to be. Well, nobody can. Pastor can. A tenured pastor of 40 years can. A sponsor can. You know, willingness is something you have to be at. You have to kind of be at a point. You know, I can't make a YouTube video. You can't pick up a how-to book. You have to have that desire to search for something more, that hunger and that thirst. You'll go to any lengths for it. In addiction, I mean, that's what we did in active addiction. We went to any length for that substance to help relieve us of our current situation.
Is it possible to hunger and thirst like that after something like righteousness? How do you
100%.
hunger after righteousness in that way?
Well, that's why I'm sitting here. That's why I have dedicated my life to this. I was working through my fourth step several years ago. And, fourth step isn't scary. We don't have to complicate. All the fourth step is a template for how to repent. That's it. Simple as that. It's a format for us to write down all of our defects of characters and all of our sins and surrender them to God. While I was finishing my fourth step, I was getting ready to start my fifth step, which is a verbal confession. And I was right at the end. And that sixth and seventh step are those promises that God is going to remove those things. He's going to forgive us of our sins. And I went to Palm Coast Bible Church on a Sunday. I was invited by a friend. And I heard the pastor preach a message, and God spoke to me directly through him. And he said that inward transformations have outward implications. Man, when he told me that, when God told me that, that's it. Forever. I will serve you forever because I hear what you've told me. My life changed, what you've taken away from me. I will spend the rest of my life searching for that, searching for that righteousness through you, to glorify you in what I do. And that's what led me to this, it is every waking minute, being a mirror of my maker, being that example,
Something else Jesus said in the Bible is to love one another as I have loved you. Sounds pretty simple, but why is that so difficult?
I think you can sum up the entire New Testament in that one word. Four letters, one word. I heard a pastor preach and said it was a love story. That's what Christ's life for us was. We show others that same love, that what he did for us, and that day on the cross, on that life he lived, on the resurrection. I mean, that's the key. Love is the key. It's like and it's almost like our society and where we're at right now, people are expecting the opposite. So when we show them love, it's like shocking. They're like, what just happened? Because the power is in the love.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of the big problems that we have in our society. It's probably always been like that, but it feels like it's worse and worse. The division, the kind of contention, we're prone to arguing and fighting with each other. And how do we add peace into the mix?
I think it's just being an example. I mean, Christ, he says in Isaiah that I'm going to give you as a light to the Gentiles, right? Like I said earlier, we are a mirror of him. We are him who is in us, which is that light, So if we are that light to others that are in the darkness, being that example of him, Christ-like, Paul talks about constantly having that mind of Christ, Our thoughts, right? Our thoughts become our actions, So if we go through life thinking about love, thinking about others, taking others into consideration, right? Our actions are going to reflect that. So just being an example, like he was to us and like we should be to others.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about the sort of almost like a group prayer session, with the sharing. What about when someone is on their own and I'm just feeling kind of low? What are the secrets to having the prayer that's going to be meaningful for me, that's going to make a difference for me?
You know, one of the things that I love about the jail, I professionally, I work in the jail. I run a men's recovery program in the Flagler County Jail. It's called the SMART program. And I am hands-on with 18 men every day. I have a whole block. I go in there every day, and we teach life skills and coping skills. But I'm hands-on with these men. The one thing about the jail is that the need and necessity for a change is apparent. It's obvious. How can I make it more obvious? Look at what we're wearing. I always kind of talk about that gift of desperation, right? Gift of desperation, God, right? At that times in our lives, that's what we need. We need that gift of desperation. Willingness can't be taught. So if I can pray for anything for you, that newcomer or that person, I'll pray that you have that gift of desperation, that right now you're at that point where you're willing to do anything,
So if we don't feel desperate enough, is it possible that we won't have that bridge to connect ourselves to God as much? That sounds kind of discouraging, because I don't want to always be living always desperate, so that I can be more close to God in a way.
Right. Well, I think it's that leveling of pride, that leveling of ego. I like acronyms. I'll hit you another acronym, right? Mm-hmm. Ego, edging God out. We need to level that ego, and I think a lot of that, we're in a society, it's kind of like pick yourself up by your own bootstrap kind of society, until we kind of get to that point, of surrender, willingness, desperation, we're not in control,
Yeah. It is some people, I think, probably feel like it's not really, a few days might go by and you realize, yeah, I haven't really prayed much lately, or maybe nothing seemed important enough to pray about. What would you say to that person?
I think it's easy to pray when we're in the valley, but it's hard for us to pray when we're on top of the mountain. We love to ask God and pray to God when things are going wrong. But when things are going right, it's hard for us to give him the glory.
Is that because we thought we were the ones that built the mountain?
Yeah, right. This guy, you know what I mean? It's that ego. It's that self-centeredness coming in again. And I think one of the things it teaches us in that program of AA, is that prayer needs to be a consistent thing. When we get to step 10 and we get to 11 and 12, those are our living steps. I'm taking that daily inventory. When things crop up, I'm going to, prayer and meditation. I'm asking God for direction. So throughout the day, a little funny story. I was a mailman for a while, and early in my recovery, and I wasn't a very good mailman, and in my addiction, when I got sober in 2015, I was still a mailman. And then it was early, and when I was talking to Jeff, it was my sponsor, he'd be okay. When I was talking to Jeff, he would always, I told you, instruct me to pray. So I would drive around in the mail truck, and I would have a conversation like God was literally sitting right beside me, and I was talking to him like he was literally right there, and I kind of think it's funny because I was like from two opposite ends of the spectrum while my career in the post office, and people were probably looking at me, look at the crazy mailman driving down the road. Must be too hot out for him, because he's talking to somebody who's not there.
And you have no doors. So, I mean, everyone knows what you're doing.
Like, who's he talking to driving around that mail truck? But I think that's our idea of what prayer really needs to be. It's just a conversation. It doesn't necessarily have to be on our knees at the foot of our bed. I mean, just as simple, it's a relationship, it's a friendship, it's just having a conversation.
How can you tell when God is talking back to you?
I think it's apparent. One of the things, that I heard, it was another catchy little phrase, is that God speaks through skin faces. When these coincidences happen, they're not coincidences. That's God talking back to you. That's God maybe answering your prayer. Maybe, I kind of used the analogy today. I literally just taught a class today, and we're talking about how God kind of like littered. He would kind of sprinkle these little pieces of things throughout our entire life, but we couldn't notice them because we weren't conscious of him. So if we're seeking that, if we're seeking his conscious presence, we're going to notice those little things that he leaves us, and breadcrumbs. And it happens. It happens more often than we think it does.
Mm-hmm. So what else have you been reading in the Bible lately on your own?
Honestly, I have been reading a lot in Romans. I am trying to get out of Romans, but the Lord's not letting me get out of Romans.
Just like Paul probably wanted to get out of Rome at some point.
Oh, I'll tell you what. It's that just the struggle with the flesh and the struggle with the spirit, that battle that's going on right there.
So Paul talks about
things.
Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh, right? That's at least how it is in the King James. I'm not sure. That's the one that I always use with me and my family and my church. I go to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we use King James. So what is that concept of the thorn in the flesh? It seems like Paul wanted to get rid of a weakness, whatever it was, and it wouldn't go away. Like, why won't God take away our weaknesses sometimes?
Well, I think that's a testimony of faith. He doesn't want us to take away all of those weaknesses because he wants us to yearn for him, and that idea of faith. We have, as we grow and we develop, we're having faith in him. I think, one of the things that Paul makes clear is that fleshly mind view, that mindset, and that spiritual mindset. When things happen, right? When things happen in life, and things always happen in life, things happen. People die, people go away, relationships end, we lose jobs, bill collectors come. I mean, that's just life, But when those things happen, how do we view them? Are we viewing them from that spiritual mindset? Are we doing them from that fleshly mindset? That thorn that's in his flesh, that's just that worldly, that selfish, that ego, that mindset that keeps on lingering, and that yearning we want to have that Christ-like mindset. We want to see things on that spiritual nature.
Yeah, some people, and this will be my last question. Some people seem to see suffering of innocent people as evidence that there must not really be a God, because how could he allow that to happen? Children to starve to death, for example.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. I get a lot of those phone calls kind of from long lost friends when life hits that brick wall, family dies, children, all the above. One of the things we always kind of directed is, okay, how are we gonna glorify God? How are we gonna look at this situation from that other side? And just trying to encourage them. That's tough, because people, it hurts, it's pain, so just trying to comfort them with that love and just kind of like reassure them, that God has a plan. This is part of his purpose, and how to glorify God in that situation. That's a challenging one. I don't really think it's the fact that that argument comes up whether he exists or not, but it's our outlook on it. We live in a sinful, fallen world. It has been that way. And just like is it getting worse? There's technology enabling the awareness. of it, or is technology promoting the fall? Um, I think just that's mostly being that comfort in those times.
My goal with doing this show is to have technology be used to do something good with it. So I really appreciate you being willing to be a guest. Hopefully I can meet you in person someday. Thanks for what you're
Yeah,
doing in jail. Thanks for what you're doing with people who are recovering. And I can tell that you're a great light for other people. So thank you
appreciate it.
so much for being my guest. Will Motosicky from Palm Coast or Recovery Church Palm Coast. Thanks again to Douglas Property and Development, Stevenson Wilcox and Associates, and Big John's Appliances for supporting Faith in Flagler. We'll see you next week.